We will go into the first session. 我们接下来就要进行第一轮的讨论，中国经济的转型对世界经济的影响。今天我们的主题一直是在围绕中国经济的转型。我多说两句，在2008年的时候，当世界金融危机刚刚出现，中国中央政府拿出了4万亿来拯救中国的经济。那几年的时间过去了，我们发现经济危机似乎远没有我们想象的那么容易过去。因此现在其实如果大家关注中国的话，就会发现中国各个地方政府都在纷纷拿出自己的小4万亿的计划在刺激经济。这是否也是我们预期中的中国转型的一部分呢？明显不是。那中国到底应当在经济和政治方面如何转型呢？这就是接下来我们要商讨的话题。首先发言的是北京大学国家发展学院执行院长、经济学教授邬和茂先生，有请。
Thank you. So it's my honor to participate in the China Dialogues, Bridges China Dialogue. We use English because it may be not so easy to translate economic terms from Chinese back to English. And I will prepare the background for our dialogue and discussion. So I will cover 3 aspects of China's economy and its implications for the global market. The first one will about the next page. The first one will be about the China's role in the world market. Okay, the next slide. Okay. So you can see that certainly there's a global financial crisis, 2008 and in the early part of 2009. You can see there's a major impact also on China's trade figures. But you look at after global financial crisis, the monthly trade statistics has increased. And take the level before the financial crisis. Take the import is about 100 billion. After the crisis, it's climbing, and currently is about 150 billion. It's the import of China from the rest of the world. So it has increased a lot. Okay? It's certainly a contribution to the world recovery. Also, next page. Also, you can look at import from different regions in the world. Okay? It's somewhat evenly distributed among different areas. We economists compute this kind of so-called contribution to world economic growth by different countries. So in the last 10 years, since 2001, after China entered WTO, China has been the major source of world economic growth. So its contribution is about 20 to 25% of world economic growth momentum. The second one is the United States. So you can see the China, as Ambassador Yi mentioned, has been very important in the world market. Next page. Also, as Mr. Pascal Nami mentioned, China's investment in the world has increased tremendously. So before the crisis, take 2007, China's outward direct investment about 26 billion US dollars. Now it stands at 68 billion US dollars. It's 2.5 times of the level before crisis. Also take the direct investment in major European countries, not the total Europe, just major European countries. Before crisis, it was 1.5 billion. Now it's 6.7 billion. It's about 4 times the level before financial crisis. So China's contribution to world economic growth is quite significant. So my first point here is that whether China can meet its short-term and long-term challenges in economic transformation will be a very important factor for world economic growth into the future. That's the first aspect I want to emphasize. Next page. Secondly, let me talk about China's short-term economic challenges. So after the global financial crisis, just Ms. Dong just mentioned, China has this kind of 4 trillion renminbi stimulus plan. It has impact certainly on the CPI, the inflation rate. So you can see the inflation rate going up. So one aspect. The other aspects include the asset inflation, especially in the housing market. Also, this has an impact on the local government debt. So we deal with this kind of problem like the United States, dealing with the subprime problem because there's a housing market problem in China. Also, we are dealing with the local government debt problem like a Greek problem to Europe after the global financial crisis. Certainly, the stimulus plan helped China to overcome the global financial crisis, but it has an adverse consequence, as you can see, the inflation. Next page. Also, you can see the growth rate. Certainly, the trough, the worst part, occurred in the first quarter of 2009. The quarterly growth rate is 6.6%. We consider that as hard landing. So people usually ask the question whether China is going to have hard landing or soft landing. We will use that as a criteria, whether China's quarterly growth rate will fall below 7%. Currently, maybe after examining some data and current policy options, China will not have a hard landing. It may have soft landing. Okay. Next page. So this is the impact on the housing market. You can see the investment in the housing market. Certainly, the big jump is due to stimulus plan. Okay. Then it somewhat slowed down, and currently somewhat stable. So the private sector's investment in housing market has decreased, but the government investment in supportive housing has increased somewhat to make it somewhat stabilized. So would the China housing market collapse, cause some kind of subprime crisis like in the United States? The answer may be no. Okay? It's somewhat stabilized now. But certainly it caused a problem after the global financial crisis. But this, I guess, the serious period has been passed. Next page. Also, we examine the local government debt problem. We abbreviate it as LGD, okay, local government debt problem. So in 2010, there's an audit of all the banks at all level and all local government at all levels. So the total amount of local government debt is 10.7 trillion, okay, renminbi. Some private sector has a little higher estimate, but it's just 2 trillion more. So it's not different from the official statistics. So it's about 26% of GDP that year. All the local government debt problem, all the debt mostly issued by the banks. Okay, so-called problem for banks. Next page. So if we add local government debt and also the central government debt together, divided by GDP, is still just about 60% of China's GDP. We use quite a high estimate from the IMF. Actually, China's own statistic is lower for the central government debt. So that's somewhat manageable. Next page. So certainly, China takes steps to strengthen the fiscal discipline on government expenditure at all levels. Try to. Okay. Certainly, in the recent months, the more local government investment, but certainly it's of a much smaller size than in 2009. Also, some of the local government debt is due to the local government responsibilities beyond their revenues. So due to the 1994 tax law, so that need to be somewhat shared by the central government. So the worst part is about 1.8 to 2.5 trillion bad loans. This is somewhat the government need to prepare for by injecting more capital into a banking system. Anyway, the central bank may step in, and the total debt level in China not that high, so that this problem may not be so serious as the so-called Greek problem in Europe. So for this part, for short-term challenge to China, we think that the outlook is quite all right. Okay? After May of this year, Premier Wen emphasized the stabilization of growth in China. So there are some more investment in infrastructure, as I just mentioned, by local government. But this time, the government has been much more careful now, because they learned from the stimulus plan of 2009. Also, into the future, the growth rate will be lower than 10%. It may be maintained at 8%. It's actually healthy growth, because China had to go through this kind of transformation in economic structure. So that the lower growth rate is better for the economic transformation. So for this part, for China's short-term challenge, I think the outlook is bright. At the same time, you should notice that China will grow at a lower growth rate into the future. Maybe 7% to 8% for this year. The total growth rate for 2012 may be just a little below 8% or just around 8%, will not fall below 7%. So this is for the China's short-term challenges. Next, let's look at the more difficult part of China's long-term challenges. One person mentioned that China's growth strategies have been unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. The person was Premier Wen Jiabao. Okay, so this has been, I guess, recognized by the government clearly, the problem faced by China into the future. So we said China reform since 1978. The first 30 years or so have been quite successful, but it's a shallow water. Now we enter the period of a deep water period, because it's treacherous and dangerous. Several problems, many of our distinguished guests spoke about that. But let me just list them here. Certainly, the structure imbalance. Okay, it's a low consumption. And in the past, we rely so much on investment and export, but it's not so reliable into the future. So China's growth strategy has to change. Secondly, and maybe even more important, is this kind of unequal income distribution. Inequality inside China has caused, I guess, the social tension and many problems. Also, there's an urban-rural gap. So urban income is about 3 times of the rural income. Third, there's insufficient social insurance and medical services for social welfare. Fourth, certainly, there's maybe one focus of the whole dialogue about the pollution and natural resource constraint. Okay? So it's the main problems, but I just listed some of them here. But certainly to deal with these kind of problems, we need supply-side growth strategies, not just demand-side. We just mentioned about how to deal with short-term challenges. We emphasize on demand side. But into the future, China has to pay more attention to the supply side. Next. The main challenges, there are also several solutions proposed. Okay? There's a complicated problems. So solutions will also be complicated and many-dimensioned. Certainly, we can solve some problems with one solution, but we need to deal with also other challenges at the same time. Okay? At least some challenges may not be complete, but there are also some solutions. Some solutions may help the other solution, but some solution may hurt some other solution to another question. we have in mind. So certainly, it's a complicated situation. We turn to the next page. So the policy orientation emphasized by the government's 12th five-year plan, or also in our discussion by economists, there's a policy orientation into the future will have less emphasis on GDP growth rate per se. Okay? So 8% or 7% will be the new normal for China's future growth rate. There will be more emphasis on institutional reform and market liberalization. The institutional reform include the legal and political side. The market liberalization include the enforcement of antitrust law to eliminate the monopoly by state-owned enterprise and promote some kind of fair competition by the private enterprise. It's a more micro side. Okay? And should have more emphasis on international trade balance and more emphasis on domestic consumption as a major source for economic growth. So it's a more macro side. The third one should be more emphasis on social insurance and inland development. Okay? Certainly, it's also related to Mr. Zhang's opening remark about urbanization. There will be more urbanization into the future, but hopefully with a smaller and a medium-sized city, not like a super huge city like Shanghai or Beijing. Should be more urbanization into a smaller size cities. The last one is related to our dialogue in more environmental protection, energy saving, and emission reduction, so that we need to have more economic mechanism to reflect the cost of scarce resources. So for this part, I would like to emphasize the long-term challenges for China is complicated and multidimensional. The solution is also complicated. But we should take a total approach to the kind of solutions. Solving one problem may have a positive or negative impact on solution of another problem. So we need to take a total approach to see a constraint for each solution to a different problem China has faced. So this is my 3 points offered for the background for our discussion. Thank you.
谢谢吴先生的数据。其实刚才吴先生提出来的7%还是8%这样的一个 GDP 增速的问题，是让中国人、让中国的经济学家、让中国的执政者非常非常纠结的这样的一个问题。因为7%、8%，这是中国往前发展，有人说这是必须要有的一个速度。这就好像骑自行车，你没有一定的速度，自行车会倒下的。但是也有经济学家说，恰恰是我们要维持着这样的一个所谓的比较高的增长速度，使中国的一系列的问题被掩盖住了。其实我们今天要在论坛上要解决的，可能就恰恰是这样的一个非常纠结的问题：中国未来的道路到底是快是慢？到底要速度还是要质量？等等等等。那接下来我们听 Regina Abrami， 来自哈佛大学商学院高级研究员。
Thank you so much. Okay. Well, first I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present a few thoughts today. It's very kind of you. I am not an economist, so I always get nervous when I sit next to an economist because we tend to see things differently, but we actually seem to be in some agreement. So what I thought I would do in my limited time was really try to maybe focus on some big trend issues or broad issues, which kind of touches on the themes of this particular session, which is around economic transition, what we expect to come from it, and really whatever happens in China, what do we think its impact is going to be on the global economy and its trading partners. And to set that in context, I thought, let's think back to 10 years ago. Now, everyone knows China is a critical part of the global economy. We've certainly heard that so far. But no one knew, again, thinking back 10 years ago, that China would so quickly emerge as not just the second largest economy, but actually the second largest, sort of world largest manufacturing exporter. In addition, I think nobody predicted the incredibly important role that China plays today in the developing world. I think that caught everybody by surprise. I think the strategies and the policies and the techniques by which China is having an impact, positive, I would say, in the developing world has also fundamentally challenged our understanding of how one develops an economy, how one works with developing country governments, and what is the best method for economic growth. No one could have thought of that. And next, I would say that no one, and this coming from my particular part of the world that I work in, is that no one could have imagined how quickly Chinese companies would occupy not just leading positions, but in some cases top positions in many, many high value-added sectors. And I'm just going to name a few here, because China, as you know, tends to work in intermediate products. So sometimes you don't see China, but China's there, I assure you. They're in my classroom all the time, in fact. Just one, Goldwind, wind turbines. Sany, heavy construction equipment. ChemChina, chemicals and biochemicals. Mindray, medical devices. And, of course, Huawei ZTE, telecommunications. And last but not least, I am going to guess, and this again says something about the arrogance of some of us, and I kind of could put the U.S. in that category. I don't think any of us would have expected that China would have played such a pivotal role in keeping much of the globe afloat after the global economic crisis. So we have a country that is, without question, profoundly important to the global economy and profoundly full of surprises. So we can't help but be optimistic about China because we've seen what it has done. So you have to be optimistic. On the other hand, this isn't going to be just a talk about optimism. That would not be my job, even though I'm at a business school and we have to be optimistic or prices decline. But I'm not talking to business people now so I can be pessimistic. There's no need for me to be confident. So if we just look again, one other fact would be the value of outbound mergers and acquisitions. So between 2002 and 2011, M&A, outbound M&A from China has increased about 30% annually. And according to BCG, that's Boston Consulting Group, I don't work for them, I mean, even though we're in the same area, but according to BCG, today, Chinese companies overseas employ 780,000 people around the world. Okay, 780,000. I have no idea how they came up with that number, but it is interesting. So, next we have to ask, so should we be optimistic? And of course, the answer is, the politically correct answer is cautiously optimistic, of course. But let me explain why. 10 years ago was also a time when we would say, and Chinese people would say, that the state retreats and the private sector advances. Right? That's what we said 10 years ago. We don't say that anymore about China. In China, they don't say that anymore either. In fact, instead, the phrase that's more commonly said is that the state advances and the private sector retreats. In fact, if we were to prepare a graph that just looked at the concentration of assets over time, we not only would see the number of obviously top largest central state-owned enterprises, the number of the largest concentrating over time, but also we would see that relative in terms of overall assets, that they're overwhelmingly concentrated in the state-owned sector, partly because of the industries that they're involved in, but nonetheless, if we were to draw a 10-year line graph, it would look like an X. Okay? More and more assets, smaller and smaller number of state-owned enterprises, greater concentration of wealth and assets in a narrower set of players. Now, I'm a political economist by training, so I count the number of people that can get in my way of doing what I want. So if I see that there's a concentration of assets or wealth or power anywhere, I get nervous because I know that that compromises my ability to do what I want to do. So if I were the Chinese government, I'd be worried about that concentration of assets in such a narrow number of players. Just me personally. Because I know that in a strategy, in a game, trying to do decision-making, it becomes more and more difficult. And I think that markets are actually recognizing that, not the least China's wealthiest. So we have seen, for example, that money is leaving China now. This is a survey that was done, I believe, reported recently, I think in The Economist. 16% of households with incomes over 10 million renminbi in China have emigrated, or if not, are now foreign passport holders. Among that same category, expressing confidence in the Chinese economy, only 28% have expressed confidence in where China is heading in the next 2 years. So short-term, cautiously optimistic or somewhat pessimistic. That's down from last year, where that same survey had 54% of China's most wealthiest feeling quite optimistic. Bain and Company with Huran have also done a study which also found that 60% of that same group, meaning those with over 10 million renminbi of income, are now also considering the possibility of becoming foreign passport holders. Now, that's great. It's a sign of globalization as well, but I think it's a sign as well of market confidence. So I raise all this because, again, I'm not an economist. So while I could give you policy recommendations, as a political economist, I would say the problem is actually a lot more difficult than that. I think what China's facing today, meaning the government, is not a policy problem. It has no shortage of smart people who can design policies. What's happening is, I think, a credibility gap. So there's now, I would say, a credibility gap at home and a trust gap overseas. Those are far harder things to solve. But they are also the things that must be solved by the incoming leadership, which is how do you instill a sense of credibility with the people so that when you implement the policies, they are believed. That has to be number one priority. And the reason why is because what we did see is that over the past three decades, China has benefited from what we would call performance legitimacy, rapid economic growth, overall improvements in standards of living, and so increasing quality of life generally. And let us not forget the millions and millions and millions of Chinese people who were lifted out of poverty. This is undeniable. But when the economic crisis hit, we also had a chance to see some fault lines that now we talk about as a rebalancing problem in China today. I'm not going to list all of them. You've already heard some of them. I'll just focus on one relevant to the business community, and that has to do with financial rebalancing. Now here we're talking about, or I'm going to talk about just two pieces because I don't want to run over time. One is obviously, again, relating to closing the credibility gap, would be a fair or level playing field between private and state-owned companies with regard to access to capital. We all remember the case of Wu Ying. And why was that such a sensitive case? Because here was a story of an entrepreneur who had made her successes partly through informal financing channels that then became very apparent that everybody was Wu Ying, that when everyone thought of how they made it, they also had to sometimes rely on informal financing channels to succeed. In other words, there wasn't transparency about how to get access to capital, and then because of that, there isn't transparency on how people became wealthy. This is a credibility problem to be solved. The other fault line regarding financial rebalancing that came out of the global financial crisis was over-leveraging in the business community, over-leveraging of private enterprises, such that when it was no longer easy to get access to informal capital, we realized the very narrow margins on which many private enterprises operated. This was seen most profoundly in Wenzhou, where Premier Wen Jiabao went to Wenzhou to express his support for ensuring that there will be a new mechanism, a new device, apparatus to help get credit to these people. But we also saw it in the public sector. You mentioned recently about, speaking of real estate and over-leveraging and companies. So it also was there. So I think this is one area where there is some need for adjustment. Now, why I say this and why it matters is because China's problems are actually the world's problems. China's challenges are the world's challenges. And I think it's always important to remember that before we engage in any finger-pointing about how China needs to do things differently. At the same time, because China is so integrated into global markets, and more increasingly so, the reality is that the Chinese government is not the only actor who gets to determine the worth of China anymore. That is a big difference. Chinese companies are traded globally, many of them. Many of them are seeing their valuations decline. Their valuations are declining because there is some analyst sitting in London, sitting in New York, sitting in Sao Paulo, sitting somewhere, sitting in Geneva, who is looking at declining domestic demand, who is looking at a declining cost position, a competitive cost position, rising labor costs, and then saying, what is the government going to do? So this is, again, a very interesting, critical transition point. So I think I need to wrap. I do have more to say, but I will stop here and just say that while these are challenges, I have no doubt that China can solve them. The question is whether or not, with the current transition that China is in its economy, will it be easier to foster reform by further strengthening of the state-owned sector or by somehow weakening it in a way that allows for greater accountability and greater ability of government to put in place the kinds of policy changes that it knows are necessary. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Regina 捕捉到了中国社会的很多非常现实的问题，但是我作为一名记者，我在这里也捕捉到了一个问题，就是我作为记者在看到我的国外的同行在描写中国的时候，往往更用一些负面的报道。但是我发现在一些国际论坛上，一些来自国外的专家在研究中国的专家，他们的观点往往相对于正面。我不知道这种差异是为什么。
I do not have the answer to that. At least not now. I'll stop and turn it over to our others. I don't know. I have good Chinese friends. They talk to me honestly. I don't know. Maybe that's it.
Maybe you know much more about China. So.
I don't know. I talk to a lot of Chinese companies, and a lot of them come to my classroom, and many of my students are from China, so I think that's probably what helps.
Thank you.
Yeah.
好，我们再请石敏俊先生，来自中科院虚拟经济与数据科学研究中心的副主任。
好，谢谢主持人。我们今天这个讨论的问题，中国经济的转型，涉及到很多的方面。比如说这个外需和内需的平衡的问题，消费和投资的比例问题啊，还有这个内涵增长和外延增长的问题啊。那么这个我的这个发言呢，主要是集中在这个怎么样从这个外延的增长转向这个内涵式的发展。那么我讲两个方面。第一个方面呢，主要是资源环境的约束对中国经济转型的这个影响。第二个问题，我讲中国经济的转型对世界经济的一些影响。那么关于这个第一个问题呢，这个我是经济学家，但是也是科学家，所以我想这个用几组这个数据啊，来这个说明一些问题。那么第一组数据呢，我们这个2010年，中国经济啊这个总量，我们 GDP 占全球的比例是9.3%啊，那么大数就是10%啊。那我们的能源消费量呢是占全球的20%，是32.5亿吨标煤。那么这个可以看出来啊，我们这个这种粗放式的这个增长。那么第二组数据呢是2015年，也就是“十二五”规划的目标。我们这个“十二五”期间全国的这个 GDP 增长率的这个目标啊，是定在7%。那么各省呢也都制定了“十二五”规划的目标，没有一个低于8%的啊，最低是8%。那么有不少的省份呢是在7% 10几啊、15、14啊这样的很多，像重庆、贵州啊、新疆都是13%、14、15啊。那么我们测算一下，按照各个省区制定的“12·5”规划的这个增长目标，那么到2015年所需要的能源消费量是多少呢？大概是46.5亿吨。那么也就是说，从32.5亿吨要增加到46.5亿吨。那么这是个什么概念呢？我们这个“12·5”规划还有一个节能减排的目标。中国政府啊提出来的这个目标呢是能源消费强度啊要降低啊，也就是单位 GDP 的能源消费量要降低16%。那么按照刚才各省制定的目标发展的话，那么我们最多这个能源消费强度啊只能降低10%，也就是说“12·5”规划制定的16%的这样的一个目标是不能实现的。所以呢，这个中国政府呢就要推出一项新的这个政策啊，叫做能源消费总量控制。那么要把这个2015年的能源消费总量控制在41.5亿吨。那么这样的话呢，我们16%的这个节能的目标才能实现。那么这样一算的话呢，就是这个按照各省的目标和全国的目标，这个差距啊，这个能源消费总量啊要差大概是5亿吨。这是2015年的这个数字。那么如果按照中国政府现在新的这个政策，能源消费总量控制啊要实施的话呢，那么这个目的当然是因为我 GDP 目标我各省的我控制不了，那我就来控制你的能源消费量。那么以此啊，我们叫倒逼机制啊，要求各省或者调整你的经济发展方式啊，降低能耗，或者就是降低你的发展速度。但是呢，这个政策啊，迟迟没有出台。为什么呢？如果这个政策一旦实施的话，那么各个省区的制定的“12·5”规划的目标，基本上是不太可能实现的，都要降低啊1到2个百分点。所以各个省区的抵触呢就很强烈啊，地方政府跟中央政府一再讨价还价。所以最后这个方案到现在还没有公布啊，还没有进入实施，但是这个拖过去2年了，迟早要推出来。这个如果不推出的话，那么这个“12·5”规划的目标可能就比较危险啊。第二组数据，那么第三组数据呢是2020年的。那么2020年呢，中国政府已经公布了这个节能减排的目标，这个碳排放强度是要比2005年降低40%到45%，非化石能源的比例啊要占到这个整个能源消费的15%。那么我们按照一个我们认为相对比较合理、现实的速度来进行分析啊，在2015年之前啊，“12·5”期间按照7%到7.5%的增长。“13·5”期间，也就是2016年到2020年，按照6%到6.5%这样的一个发展速度的话，那么2020年的能源消费总量是多少呢？大概是在50亿吨，啊，也就是从32.5亿吨啊增长到50亿吨。那么这个50亿吨的这个，我按照15%来算，就是非化石能源的，就是7.5亿吨。那么主要是水电、核电和风电。那么水电现在是相对比较现实的啊，这个要增加到大概3.6到3.8亿这个千瓦的装机啊，这个相对比较可能实现。核电呢 是要从现在的1000万装机增加到7000到8000万的装机。那是个什么概念呢？就是增加大概要7倍，6到现在我们4个核电站1000万装机，那就是要增加6倍，也就是再修同样的规模的话，要修24个核电站，而且要在2020年前建成我们核电站的建设周期很长。那么平均每个省将来要有1个核电站。那么现在还在批判核电大跃进这个争议还有，所以最近公布的新能源发展规划名字改了改成可再生能源发展规划核电的目标就没有公布比较敏感。那么大概我们算一下，水电大概在2020年能占到8%到9%，核电按照这个目标实现的话是能够占到4%。那么剩下就是风电了。那么风电呢，装机我们能上去可以在1000瓦以上，但是并网的比例比较低按照2000到3000万这个并网的话，大概能占到2%的比例。这样的话呢，满打满算可以实现15%的目标。那么化石能源我们除了石油是进口以外这个煤我们是能挖得出来的这个是有的。那么现在我们回到前面讲的这个速度7%到7.5%是12.5%，13.5%是6%到6.5%。这个目标其实各个省区肯定是不认同的经济学家很多人也不认同我们林一峰先生认为还可以继续发展8%，继续可以保持10到20年不同场合说过这个话。那么实际上那么按照这样来说的话呢，就是我们经济学家也好的看法也好，还是各地的这个政府的领导的这个愿望也好，这个目标可能太保守了。那么如果按照我们的这个发展的这个愿望来发展的话呢，那么2020年50亿吨的这个能源消费总量肯定是打不住，肯定会超过。那么如果超过的话，那么从哪来呢？这个能源，特别是非化石能源，这15%从哪找出来？唯一的可能性是风电那么现在风电可能要有些大动作，争取提高这个并网的这个比例那么就是我们说现在这个，如果按照各地的这个发展的愿望的话，我们认为可能比较合理的目标，可能合理的速度可能难以保持。那反过来又对这个资源环境的这些要求提出了挑战。那么第4组数据呢是2050年的。我们对2050年比较长远的这个目标也做了一些这个分析和模拟。那么我们首先模拟的是按照一个这个 business as usual 这个基准的情景。那么2020年前是7.2%，2030年前是5.2%的。那么2030到2040大概按3.6%，2040到2050的话是2.4%。这个目标也是相对比较保守了。那么实际上我们最后算一下呢，我们把资源环境的约束考虑进去，特别是能源的，我们首先考虑能源的这个供应。实际上这个目标是实现不了的，大概就有能源供应、化石能源供应这一项，要使这个目标降低大概0.6到0.7%，那本来已经比较低了，还要进一步的降低。也就是说，我们长远来看，资源环境特别的这个约束迫使中国经济要转型。那么我们现在只说了能源的，还有水资源的约束，还有环境容量的约束。刚才说到煤我们能挖出来，但是煤挖出来烧了以后还能带来很多环境的问题，还有水的问题。所以呢，我们通过这几组数据呢，我就想表达一个观点就2句话。第一句话呢是转型是势在必行的，就是我们中国经济的转型这个是我们可持续发展的一个内在需求，不得不转型 不得不要调整，给我们转变经济发展方式。那么第二句话呢，就是降速是在所难免的，我们很难维持过去这样的高速度的增长。资源环境的约束迫使中国经济的增长速度要降低。所以这是我讲第一个问题。那么第二个问题呢，那么在这样的一个背景下面，对世界经济会有什么样影响？那么我们刚才讲了，中国经济现在占到全球的比例 ，GDP 总量大概大数是10%，我们这个人口呢是20%，能源消费量是20%，还有我们这个中国经济对世界经济增长的拉动效果或者贡献率是20%到40%之间波动大概每年有些变化。那么可以表明中国经济在世界经济中的这个一个地位和影响是十分重要了。那么中国经济的转型势必会给这个世界经济带来一些影响。那么首先一个影响呢，就是现在这种益处的效果会减弱。那么当然了，将来我们也很难再继续维持过去那样的一个这个出口拉动比例或者贡献率那么高这样的一个格局。那么第二个影响呢，可能就是我们这种结构的变化，我们可能有一些是主动要求变，要减少一些高耗能、高污染、高资源消耗的这样的产品的生产和出口。第二个呢，在这样一个背景下呢，我们的资源和要素成本也会进一步上升，也会推动可能新的一轮国际的产业转移和国内的产业转移。那么第三个影响呢，我想我们可能中国经济也会给世界经济带来一些新的机会，因为我们将来会更加重视绿色经济的发展，走绿色发展的道路。这样呢，我们像节能环保产业、新能源的产业，还有其他的一些绿色产业，包括我们传统产业的绿色改造，这样的一些产业，我们会有非常旺盛的投融资的需求。现在有很多测算在分析中国未来有多大的这个绿色经济的投融资需求。那么这个可以给很多海外的企业带来新的这个商机。所以我想我们可能通过这样的一些数据可以来描绘中国经济未来的一些这个景象，以及会给我们中国经济以及世界经济会带来什么样的一些影响。我就讲到这里，谢谢。
有一个问题是，先生，刚才您说按照您的测算，如果按照目前中国能源的消耗量的话，可能2020年会突破50亿这样的一个数字。但是我们知道，从现在已经是12年到2020年8年的时间不到。那可能转型是一个美好的愿望，但是转型如果说真实发生的话，恐怕不会用这么短的时间，在短期内不会转成什么样不知道。而短期内可以确认的是，能源消耗量一定会突破。如果这同时发生，后果会是什么？
好，我简单说一下那么这个能源总得有地方来，那么不外乎几个渠道了，一个就从海外进口。那么我们只要现在石油从海外进口这个2亿多吨但这个量将来能够增加到多少？这个很难说短期内前景不是很大。那么第二个就是继续扩大我们这个化石能源的规模多挖煤第三个就是发展非化石能源。那么前面讲到这个，我们有主要的几项这个水电、核电、风电，当然还有太阳能、生物质能等等。那么这个太阳能当然也在关注，但是相对它的这个量要少一些，这整个总量总盘子里头的比例还是比较小。 那么我们从这几个地方去看看这个出路的话，其实出路是有限的，所以没有多少选择可以给我们，所以我们还是要回过头来走这个转型的这个之路。那么这个转型我们也做了测算，那大概也是3个方面，一个就是能源效率的提高，我们的像这个能源部门，特别是发电煤耗我们还有这个提高的这个余地这个世界上先进的发电煤耗大概是在300到310克左右，但我们现在大概是330到360克左右，我们还有余地提高。这就是终端用能，特别是工业还有生活，我们还有一些潜力可以提高。那这个部分大概我们测算一下，可能可以这个实现这个节能减排目标的贡献大概60%到70%的样子。那么还有一个就是我们刚才讲到能源这个结构的这个转换非化石能源比率的提高，再一个就是产业结构的转换，那我们还要需要一些政策措施来促进这样的一些这个转换。大致我想我们未来的这个景象不外乎大概是这样的一些这个渠道。谢谢。
好，谢谢您。请 Donald Lewis， 斯坦福大学高级研究员。
谢谢您。I first wanted to thank the organizers for this opportunity to participate in the Bridges Dialogue, particularly ICTSD, and the opportunity to continue to collaborate with ICTSD and Chinese institutions going forward. I've produced a paper for the Bridges China Dialogue, and it has 3 interrelated parts. The first part is China's transition to a green economy, then Rio 20 developments this past June, and also finally China-related trade and sustainable development issues. 我不是一个经济家，我是一个律师。I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer. So I do have a slightly different view on things. In my paper, I have expressed a central theme that, and I think this has been reflected in some of the comments already, that China has adopted essentially a new economic development model in which the green economy and sustainable development feature prominently. I call this the Green Innovation Development Model, or 绿色转型发展模式. It's also been termed the ecologizing of economic governance. This is a term that was coined by Elizabeth Economy, and it's another way of looking at the paradigm shifts that are occurring in China today. One initial point is that in adopting this new model, at least as I see it, a sustainable economic development model, China, unlike many developing countries, has apparently rejected notions that economic competitiveness and sustainable development are somehow adversaries. However, what is really most distinctive about this new Chinese economic development model is the pairing of sustainable development with innovation and technological advancement. In this regard, China views technological innovation as the core of its national development strategy. And this is to be accomplished in many cases through the realization of future-oriented green economy policies, such as those mentioned by Dr. Shi. The coupling of sustainable development and innovation is clearly evident in China's current plans, policies, and regulations related to so-called indigenous innovation, or zizhu zhuanxing, and the growth of China's strategic emerging industries, or zhuanlie, xinxing qiangye. With regard to China's strategic industries program, it is remarkable to note that most of the 7 identified priority sectors under this important program are in fact green industries and include energy efficiency and environmental protective industries, biotechnology, alternative energy industries, that is to say renewables, new materials, and clean energy automotive industries. China has actually gone to considerable lengths to realize its green innovation development model. There's a tremendous amount of state planning going on in China. Pascal Lamy made reference to this earlier, and specifically in relation to green economy and innovation programs. And these plans do not only include the 12th five-year plan regarding national economic and social development, but also a number of discrete, more detailed national plans, including the recently announced National Sustainable Economic Development Plan, the Medium and Long-Term Renewable Energy Development Plan, the Medium and Long-Term Science and Technology Development Plan, and the recently released Strategic Industries Development Plan. So state planning is very much alive and vitally important to China's economic development in this area. Backing up this new development model is unprecedented Chinese government support. For strategic industries development alone, the Chinese government is investing US $1.5 trillion in strategic industries over a 5-year period. In addition, the Chinese government is investing US $468 billion in green sectors over the same period, with a focus on 3 sectors: waste recycling and reutilization, clean technologies, and renewable energy. However, in order to achieve China's ambitious SD innovation policy goals, China needs to develop and attract technology to the country. And in this regard, FDI, foreign direct investment, has an important role to play. And as far as the very large amounts of Chinese government funding that are available, this funding is not simply for Chinese domestic enterprises, but also for foreign technology suppliers. And in this regard, China welcomes collaborative innovation and technology cooperation, and indeed a number of foreign governments are also supportive of collaborative innovation initiatives between Chinese and foreign companies, including the United States and Switzerland. Now, one of the restraints, if you like, to collaborative innovation that certainly has been expressed by many companies in the United States, and particularly in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, where I hail from, is the problem of course, of intellectual property protection in China. This is continuing to act as a significant brake on the exuberance of foreign technology suppliers being willing to enter into collaborative innovation. And of course, China is aware of these concerns. These are, of course, not new concerns. And the Chinese government has constructed a WTO consistent intellectual property regime, providing a range of safeguards for collaborative innovation and for foreign investment related to patents, copyrights, software, trademarks, and to a lesser extent, trade secrets. I also wanted to say a few words about the Rio 20 conference, which does have implications for China and its green innovation. The Rio 20 conference was concluded on June 22nd and pursued an agenda which sought to focus global attention on the advent of the green economy and the necessity for governance reform in support of sustainable development. And notwithstanding the fact that there were widely reported disappointments about the Earth Summit, Rio 20 did achieve some progress on certain green economy initiatives and forward movement on governance reform, particularly an enhanced role for the UNEP going forward. In the Future We Want, the official Rio 20 outcome document, consensus was reached on further mainstreaming sustainable development while recognizing that the achievement of comprehensive SD requires an integration of all three pillars: economic, social, and environmental dimensions. The Rio 20 outcome document is notable in that it dedicates an entire chapter to the challenges and opportunities presented by the green economy. It situates the green economy within the context of overall sustainable development and poverty eradication, and further affirms that green policies should be guided by the Rio Principles, Agenda 21, and the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation. At the same time, the outcome document acknowledges that national governments have considerable policy space to craft their own green economy national strategies. Significantly, Rio 20 recognized the interlinkages between the green economy, technology advancement, and innovation. Paragraphs 269 through 271 of the outcome document specifically address technology transfer, innovation, and IP rights in relation to green technologies for developing countries. Among the important achievements of Rio 20 were support for the development of a green domestic product index that, again, Director General Lamy alluded to earlier today, and also for the voluntary 10-year sustainable consumption and production framework. However, perhaps the most laudatory achievement of Rio 20, in the view of Gro Harlem Brundtland and others, is the setting of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as supplements to the UN's more general Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, which expire in 2015. Finally, I wanted to say just a few words about trade and sustainable development issues involving China. These have emerged really center stage over the last few months and the last 2 years or so. And in this regard, there have been several high-profile WTO and U.S. trade disputes involving China and Chinese companies. In particular, China's use of natural resource export controls, including those related to raw materials and rare earths, and renewable energy subsidies, particularly wind and solar power subsidies, have been challenged by the U.S. and others in the WTO. At the national level in the U.S. in particular, Chinese wind power equipment and solar cells have been preliminarily targeted for the imposition of both, and I stress both, anti-dumping duties and anti-subsidy CVDs, countervailing duties, by the Department of Commerce, and final determinations are awaited this fall. China, in turn, has retaliated against the U.S. It's filed a complaint against the U.S. with the WTO, challenging the propriety of the U.S. application of countervailing duties on some 22 products, including wind power equipment and solar panels, again implicating the green economy. Now, I should point out that China and the U.S. are not alone in trying to address the tensions that exist between sustainable development on the one hand and the long-standing rules and principles of the world trading system on the other. In fact, several features of national sustainability regimes raise amber or red light signals under existing GATT WTO rules. And a question that we may wish to consider further in this context, in this forum, and outside of this forum, is how can the global trading system satisfactorily accommodate sustainable development and the green economy? The ICTSD, among others, actually has been in the forefront in confronting the tensions that exist between sustainable development and trade, and indeed in positing plausible solutions, including revisiting certain environmentally relevant GATT WTO rules. To conclude, I simply want to wish the 18th Party Congress and the new leadership well, and certainly would expect that the new Chinese leadership will be able to adroitly address the challenges that we have raised here this morning and will continue to discuss later today. That's perhaps what's most important here is China adopting a proper blend of deepening market reforms, strengthened domestic institutional governance, and inspired international engagement and collaboration at all levels. So thank you. Session1.
Thank you, Donald. Finally, it's time for Q&A time. Any questions for the speaker and discussants?
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Liu Kaimin from Shenzhen, China. You have a very good panel discussing this issue, especially to discuss about China the economic development the target. I think in 2 weeks ago and this time in the Tianjin, when we talked about we did development 7% or 8% is good or is bad. I want to ask I just when we review the last 62 years China economic development, we can see actually we have a very high GDP growth rate in China. First 30 years, our GDP annual average growth rate is 6.1%. It's double than the world average growth the rate. And the second 30 years, we can see that China, the GDP annual growth rate is near 10%. Also, it's double than the world average growth rate. But we can see now China, there is more than 100 million population. The annual, the daily, the expenditure is lower than the $1, and more than 400 million the population, the daily expenditure less than the $2. And now we can in China when we talk China, we have more than 250 million migrant workers in the different cities, and also more than 58 million the children leave their hometown, but their parents work in the city. So I think if the growth, economic growth, no benefit to the people, is how to do that. And I want to ask this, or you to maybe give more explanation to that. Thank you.
Regina?
Thank you for your question. So this is a big question. You're asking how would one go about solving probably one of the most difficult economic problems, which is redistribution, which means solving problems of taxation, social welfare, and the political choices around who gets taxed what rate and who gets access to what pension welfare benefits. In China, I think it's doubly difficult because you have an institution that also needs to be reformed, the sort of household registration system that grows out of an earlier planning system that now is out of date. So I don't think there is a simple solution. I think probably most immediately the kinds of reforms that the Chinese government has been putting in place, particularly with regard to education. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of tax reforms in the countryside or the importance of rural education. There is no question that political stability is rooted in making sure that the population is hopeful for its future, and a big part of that hope comes from social mobility. China has seen phenomenal social mobility over the past 30 years. There are no number of entrepreneurs whose parents or grandparents were farmers who now are very successful. That has to continue. And I would say the policies that have to be in place begin really at the base with education, and that is the burden of government, and then ultimately at some point the burden of taxation at the top, but that is, as we know from U.S. politics and many other countries, not easy to solve. Thank you.
Nina. Mr. Fan from?
I'd like to.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask a question about Mr. Xi. He gave a very good presentation about China's new development, and it's limited by the energy resources. But I like to offer a little bit different opinion here. So basically, Mr. Xi mentioned is we are limited. The whole 12's 5-year plan or 2020 plan is limited by the energy. But the assumption is based on the current energy, right? But I'd like to offer some numbers here, the new energy, right? He mentioned the solar. I'm working on solar, but I'd like to say a few numbers here. The first is, if you look at Germany. Germany is a leading solar country, and in southern states of Germany, the solar installation in the peak value is already surpassed 30% of the total capacity, which means technologically solar is possible to provide a significant portion of the power or energy resources. That's number one. Number two is in China. China western part is very sunshine region, and they have 25% of China's land is Gobi and also the desert. And if only taking 1% land in the west part of China can provide enough power for completely the energy per year in China. Basically, there is a new technology solution. The third number is in the April this year, we have energy summit in Beijing, and I heard the Minister of the Transportation of China. He mentioned that China have largest railroad system. However, 60% of the transportation capacity today is carry the coal from one place to another. So it's terrible. And even we have enough coal, I think it's not sustainable. Yeah. So afternoon we will show more data and showing the solar really can provide a solution for that. Thanks.
So what's your question?
Comment. OK， 我做一个简单的回应啊。我想这个方总讲的这个问题呢，是大家很多人都关心的啊。但是我就想补充一点啊，就是我们这个风能和太阳能啊，这个资源非常丰富，但是呢，这个风能和太阳能这个丰富的地方都是远离经济中心的，就是能够供应能的和我们需要能的这个地方啊，这个离得很远。所以这是一个问题，就是怎么样来这个用空间上的这个一个匹配。那么不光是风能、太阳能，还有就是我们的化石能源、煤炭，这个也是这个问题，就是能生产煤的地方和需要煤的地方，这个这个空间上的距离也很远。我们现在煤的产量最大的是内蒙啊，这个已经超过山西了。下一步啊，新疆要建设大型煤炭基地啊，新疆呢现在规划是4亿吨。啊，这个第一期的是2亿吨、2亿吨的这个量，但是新疆的煤就从哈密的煤只能用到兰州，这不能往前用了，成本已经太高了。那么现在新疆这整东煤炭基地，它是2亿吨是要这个1亿吨发电用出来，1亿吨转化为煤化工产品用出来，它用不出来。我们这个电，这个风电和这个太阳能啊，也同样的问题。甘肃要在这个安西啊，在酒泉这一带 我们陆浩书记那时候我去去兰州的时候，陆浩书记说要建设陆上三峡，但是这个电发出来以后是没法用的，所以他们呢要在当地搞什么呢？搞电解铝，新疆也要搞电解铝，要搞高耗能的工业，但是他们没有铝土矿，怎么办呢？铝土矿用进去，因为我们说往西用的说是都是空的，所以就运过去，但运过去成本很高，这就有一个什么问题呢？除非将来我们的电价高到足够高的程度，当地的这个能源成本很低，外面的很高，这个差价足够能抵消运输成本的时候，才有可能发生这样的一个情况。所以我们还不能从总量上来说，还要看这个空间上的这个匹配的问题。我们还不说水资源的这个能不能支撑的问题这个时间关系我就不展开说了。
I think for time's reason, you are the last question.
I'm Philippe Monnier from the Greater Geneva-Bern area, the economic development of Western Switzerland. My question is about the solar company. In China, there are a lot of companies which are very successful and they sell all over the world, including in Europe. And recently in the USA, in Europe as well, there have been some anti-dumping measure against export of Chinese solar panel to Europe. So my question is, could somebody offer a comment to which extent this is economically justified, or is it just jealousy? On practically for the Chinese company, what could they do to mitigate this problem?
Yes, I think the question is directed to me. As far as whether or not anti-dumping actions are justified, I mean, perhaps that's beside the point to some extent. What we do need to appreciate is that China is subject currently to what is known as the NME, or the non-market economy methodology, under its protocol of accession with the WTO. And it will be subject to this somewhat irrational non-market economy treatment up until 2016. So that's a few more years. What is perhaps even more interesting, and what we see happening in the United States, and these cases are also finding their way here to Geneva and the WTO, is the combination of anti-dumping actions with countervailing duty actions, with CVD actions, which are addressing subsidization in China. And I think there are major problems with subsidization in China. As I mentioned in my paper, we see these very, very large programs of subsidization related to the green economy, to wind power, to solar power, and then linked to the traditional Chinese export strategy. And of course, that's a perfect recipe for a violation of Article 3 in terms of a per se illegal subsidy. And so China does need to address this. And of course, as I mentioned in my paper, and I think that Regina and Professor Wu and others have stressed that China must move down the path of market liberalization, must move down that path. The anti-monopoly law can play a role there, but it's essential. But at the same time, and I think Regina made this point, is that what we see in China today is the reverse. The USTR, the United States Trade Representative's Office, has pointed out that since 2006, we've actually seen, rather paradoxically, a backtracking on market liberalization, where the state is advancing and the private sector is retreating. And we also see a massive amount of state planning going on, and indeed, as a result of the fiscal measures that have been adopted with the global economic downturn, we've seen stimulus packages in China which are geared towards massive subsidization, massive support for the state sector, for state-owned enterprises. So these are very real structural problems. They must be addressed. Otherwise, China is going to continue to face anti-dumping actions and countervailing duty actions, and increasingly countervailing duty actions to deal with matters of illegal subsidization, particularly in the green sectors. Yes.
No more question, but to follow the same question, right? The first, I think in the recently, especially U.S., the anti-dumping case in the solar sector, a few factor here, right? The first, you mentioned is state-owned subsidy, and China's solar sector, top 10, all of them is come from private sector. It's the entrepreneur, they come from Australia or different countries, bring like $500,000, they create a $1 billion company and listed in the Nasdaq. So it's actually China state-owned company is not play in the sector. Reason is very marketing driving, very competitive. SOEs cannot respond. That's number one, data. The second is even for anti-dumping or anti-convenience, the ACD, the US ACD, after investigation everything together, is only charged 3.5% of the rate. ACD, anti-dumping is 35, right? So it means the subsidy is not significant, even based on non-marketing economy. And second is, I think there's a misleading. Like they say the China, the most controversial thing is China Development Bank. They announced $46 billion to solar companies, and so that's a completely misunderstanding. So although they published it's signed the MOU, it's a marketing tool. It's different, marketing tool. The company in China is very difficult to use this money right now. Also, the interest rate CDB gave is higher than the U.S. Like even Synergizes case, U.S. is very publicized today as an election year, but Synergizes case completely due to their choice of wrong technology roadmap.
Excuse me, Mr. Fang.
Okay.
I have to interrupt your comment because we have still many sessions behind. So thank you for all the speakers and discussants, your smart ideas, and thank you for all for your patience because we have more than 40 minutes delayed. So thank you all. And we'll have 10 minutes break and we will start 10 minutes later. Thank you.